Thanks. So, I think the organizers would like to start with this year's conference of PRIF. First of all, let me apologize. I have a very bad cold. This is why I'm walking around with my mask, but here I will take it off, but then I will take it on again so that you do not catch the cold that I caught, I think, from my children, as always. But coming to terms, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, it is really a great pleasure to be able to warmly welcome you all in this room, but also at home at the screens, to this year's annual conference of PRIF, dealing with the topic of dealing with autocracies in a fragmented world. Now, and in an era where China's rise and Russia's war in Ukraine dominate the global stage, we find ourselves confronted with a pressing question. That is, how should liberal democracies shape their relationship with autocracies? And this topic might seem outdated nearly, given the heinous attacks on Israel this weekend and the unfolding of a war in the area. But I think that even these events might feed very well into the topic of our conference today and tomorrow, because what is needed to be able to prevent escalation of that conflict in the region, to be able to come to terms with this conflict, that is, find potential solutions to the ongoing conflict, we need cooperation, not only among democracies, but between autocracies and democracies. Now, frequently, if you're looking at public discourse, it centers around the question of a confrontation or of regime competition. At times, we hear terms like there is a clash between democracies on the one hand and autocracies on the other, good and evil, black and white. However, not only are autocracies as well as democracy much more varied than this picture imagines, but the international landscape is also much more nuanced, with linkages and interaction between democracies and autocracies taking on a multitude of forms and mechanisms. We are very much looking forward to discussing these multiple forms, the mechanism, and the potential effects of these linkages between autocracies and democracies in various panels during the next 2 days. Now, before I pass over to the able organizers of this wonderful conference, that is Dr. Irene Weipert-Fenner, Dr. Pascal App, I would like to take one more moment of your attention to extend a special welcome to our distinguished guests today. Now, we are very honored to have with us today Consul General of the Republic of Korea, Mr. Ko. He's accompanied by the consuls Kim and Shin. Great to have you here. Consul Lee from the Chinese Consulate General in Frankfurt. Where is it? Thank you. The first secretary of the Political Embassy of the Republic of South Korea in Berlin, Ms. Stolz. Is she already here? Maybe not, but she's actually on my list. But I hadn't had the chance to talk to her in advance. Mr. Steinhilber from the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Professor Pura Kayasta, a former guest professor at PRIF. Professor Yan, a former member of our Scientific Advisory Board, there she is. And also 2 able members of the jury of the Ernst-Otto Czempiel Award, Professor Senghas Knobloch and Dr. Grevingholt. Have they already arrived? Yeah, sorry. One is already arrived yet, and I hope to see Eva later on then. And last but not least, I'm also very, very happy to say that we have Professor Robert McGinty from Durham University here with us today, who will be receiving the Ernst-Otto Czempiel Award today in recognition of his really groundbreaking book, Everyday Peace: How Ordinary People Can Disrupt Violent Conflict. Yes? A lot of reasons to applaud to this achievement. I would also like to deeply express our gratitude to the German Foundation for Peace Research, who gave us financial support to make this conference possible. And last but not least, let me also thank everyone here at PRIF who played a pivotal role in the excellent preparation of this conference. At least I think it's excellent. So this includes, of course, members of our Research Department 4, specifically Irene Weipert-Fenner, Jonas Wolf, Pascal Lapp, and Cornelia Hess, as well as our Research Communication Department with Stefan Kroll, Ursula Grünwald, Laura Friedrich, Yvonne Blum, and Leon Safin. And really, really, really not to forget, our administrative support team, Viola Niemark, Susanne Schmidt, Christine Gröber, Thilo Barth, along with the student assistants, Anna Berg, Cedric Meyer, Lena Bühring, Vivian Gertz, Yannick Kramer, and probably many more that I'm now forgetting, but they are the ones that make possible that we have the chance to meet here in person and have these wonderful discussions. So once again, welcome to all of you, and enjoy the conference. Irene and Pascal, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and of course also a hearty welcome from myself. I hope I'm on the right microphone now. As Nicole has already said, the topic of today's conference about relationships between democracies and autocracies is a very, very hot topic in contemporary international relations. Of course, against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, but also the intensifying great power rivalry between China and the United States. These are two mega phenomena that seemingly pit democracies and autocracies directly against each other. And they have created a situation in which narratives about a return to a new Cold War have gained traction. So the way this entire conference actually got started is that last year we started first in a blog post and then also in some deeper academic work to criticize this narrative. To first of all state that it is empirically not really describing the reality that we see in the world. So for example, that you see many regimes that cannot be neatly sorted into these ideal types of democracies or autocracies, but just fall somewhere in between. And of course, it does not also describe the reality of an insurmountable rivalry or perhaps even hostility between these kinds of poles of regime types. Instead, the reality is, as always, much more muddled and complicated. But still, this kind of grand narrative has gained traction, as I mentioned. It has become the dominant, I would say, guiding narrative of the Biden administration's foreign policy in the United States, and it is increasingly also being taken up by governments across Europe and Asia. So accordingly, the question of dealing with autocracies is a very, very practical one. It is something which is far more complicated, again, than just assuming that democracies will always feel a certain kinship with each other, or that there's an insurmountable hostility towards autocratic nations. And this conference is precisely designed to shed some light on these issues by empirically examining relations across several different issue areas and also world regions. This is something on which Irene will go into a bit more detail in her part. For us today, the challenge is to find a middle ground. So neither ascribing too much impact to regime types, so assuming that basically a country's foreign policy, its international behavior, is mainly determined by the question of what regime it has domestically, but also not to dissolve this whole complex picture into a web of purely bilateral relations. So only talking about, for example, relations with China or relations with Russia. Because we believe that we can actually empirically identify a couple of factors in which regime types do play a role there. And at PRIF, for this empirical effort, we have proposed the concept of regime competition. That is something which Irene and myself have just started a new research group on earlier this year. And it is also something that overlays, of course, with the work of today's conference. I will tell you a little bit about why we have proposed this specific concept and why we think it is useful. First, I think competition is a kind of interaction that is very, very encompassing. And it captures a lot of interactions specifically between states of different regime types that fall between those extremes of alliances and imagined close kinship, or, of course, strategic rivalry. So it really captures this broad middle in international interactions. Second, it can also capture two dimensions of competitive relations. One, this is probably the more prominent one nowadays, of a competition between great powers over international influence, especially in third countries. And second, a more performance-based competition where states, or in this case regimes, try to build their legitimacy by pointing to specific policy outcomes which they are delivering for their people, and then basically connecting these to inherent features of their regimes. So if you think about how various countries approached their COVID policy during the pandemic and how they try to stress how the liberal or autocratic features of their systems inform these strategies, I think this is something where you can really see it in action. Again, this research is being pooled in our eponymous research group on regime competition, which comprises some excellent colleagues here from within PRIF, but also, of course, a network of external collaborators. And I'm very happy that the first, or I should first introduce actually the blog series. This is actually one of the outputs which we're producing. And the first external blog post in this series was just published yesterday by Michelle Pace, who is also one of our guests here today. Finally, I was told to invite all of you to check out the many other materials, the research findings, reports, academic journal articles, but also policy briefs and blog posts, which have been published across PRIF on the issues which we're going to be discussing today and tomorrow. And we've prepared a rack that is right outside the back door entrance to this conference venue. And I've just been asked by a librarian to point out to you that please do not take the books which are on display there with you. The rest you can, of course, freely take as you please. We're very happy. And we're also very technologically progressive in having prepared a QR code that's right above it. So you can just scan that, and then you have all our great materials on your phone. Okay, thank you very much again for coming, and I'm handing over to Irina.
So, good afternoon also from my side. A very warm welcome. As Pascal has said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the conference. It has been highlighted now that things are not that easy. It's not either about the democracies on the one side, autocracies on the other. But still, at the same time, in some cases, we don't have to discuss much. And in our practical dialogue with decision makers and practitioners, particularly from development, cooperation, and democracy promotion, the question of how to deal with autocracies comes up all the time. And within the research group, as Pascal has highlighted, we've been working on different topics, but this is one of them. And the question is really to say, what do we know about this question? What can we contribute as academics? So first of all, dealing with autocracies, there are usually like a few norms that are floating around, usual suspects in the debate. And the first one is, when we deal with autocracies, we should do no harm. Well, this means the situation shouldn't become worse because of us. But what does this mean explicitly? We at PRIF here work with a broad understanding of peace. So spelling this out in this context could mean when we have any sort of interaction with autocracies, this shouldn't lead to more violence and repression. It should not reduce political liberties. Even further, it should not worsen social justice conflicts. Second, another usually norm debated in this context is be coherent with democratic values. And third is to understand that every interaction with autocracies, be it in a political, economic, environmental, technological aspect, is political. It's deeply political because it's embedded in the logics of an authoritarian regime that we need to study in depth if we really like to avoid doing harm and being coherent with democratic values. So first of all, this is easier said than done. This is clear. Secondly, what we also found in our academic debates is that our debates are very much fragmented, actually, between comparative politics and IR, different issue fields, different world regions, and varying degrees of conflict intensity. So the idea of this conference is, first of all, to bring these perspectives together in different panels that are still clustered more traditionally, because this will allow us to bring together established discourses and dive deep. As you might have known, because I think you studied the program in depth, the panels are structured this way that today we're going to talk about interactions with low degrees of conflict intensity. We will start with a panel on what we labeled as competition as a form of interaction in the field of infrastructure policies, with China as the most important actor. And this will be followed by a panel on cooperation with the Middle East and North Africa, in the field of energy and climate policies, an issue field where collaboration seems to be rather a duty than a question. Tomorrow we look at higher conflict intensities, starting with democracy promotion in the context of democratic backsliding and autocratization, and reaching its peak with the Russian war in Ukraine and its global implications. So while the panels are still centered in their own discourses, we like to bring them together, and we want us to reflect upon similar questions that will also facilitate a dialogue between the panels, but also importantly for our roundtable tomorrow afternoon. We identified 4 overarching questions that will be discussed in the 4 panels and the roundtable. So the first one is to say, in the interactions between democracies and autocracies that we analyze here, how relevant is actually the respective political regime type of the countries involved and the very distinction between democracy and autocracy? Second, what kind of empirical patterns of interaction do we really observe beyond the usual labels that we give them, be it cooperation, coexistence, competition, disengagement, open conflict? Third, what are the consequences of these different forms of interaction for the autocratic regimes at hand? Stabilization, destabilization, more fine-grained analysis of political transformations. And finally, what are the consequences of these different forms of interactions, as well as the narratives and the justifications that accompany them for dynamics of conflict both between and within countries? We hope you will all engage with us in the discussion of these questions today and tomorrow, as we see this conference really as a first step to bring together our academic expertise, but also, of course, to engage with decision makers and practitioners in really the question of how to deal with autocracies in a fragmented world. And as I said, quite a challenging task, of course. Before we start, let me just quickly draw your attention to the fact that the conference will be live streamed on YouTube, and this is a chance to say a very warm welcome to our online audience as well. But you should be aware of that this is live streamed, including the ceremony for you, Mr. Roger McGinty. And apart from the second panel on the Middle East and North Africa, which will be held under Chatham House rules. And now, without further ado, I wish you all a very fruitful conference. Hope you stay with us in this huge number, which is really flattering, and an excellent chance to discuss important questions as I see them now. With that, I think it's time to move on and ask the panel on China to, well, take your time, install you on the panel here. And as I said, once again, a warm welcome to PRIF and to Frankfurt.
We're a little bit ahead of schedule, so we're trying to slow things down a little bit so that we don't kind of lose some viewers on the
very
stream.
Slow.
So, yeah, let's start with some please. So maybe we can start with a, okay, I already see the answer to my question. I was going to ask for a technical check if the mics are working. I can confirm this for myself. Maybe we just go around the table and see if everybody else is also wired in.
Testing, yeah.
Looks good or sounds good.
Hello.
Perfect.
Yes. Testing.
Perfect, okay. That goes for all of us. Right. It is working indeed. Okay, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule. I hope that's not going to be a problem. So then maybe we can feature even more discussions into this very, very exciting panel that is going to kick off today's conference. When we talk about dealing with autocracies, this is of course an abstract category, autocracies. Many people are more interested in concrete cases, and the elephant in the room is then of course the case of China. So at least when you look at autocratic countries in the world, the one that definitely has the global weight, also the potential to become a peer competitor with the United States, is definitely that of China. And if you look at this rising Chinese agency in the world, this has become very closely identified with a very prominent infrastructure initiative that we're going to be discussing today. I'm talking, of course, about the Belt and Road Initiative. So this very, very well publicized effort to construct new linkages, physical linkages, but also intellectual and soft power ones across the entire world that are ultimately centered on China. So really the topic of infrastructure was considered pretty much a niche topic, certainly not something that we would consider like a top item maybe on the agenda. But ever since China announced its BRI 10 years ago, it has very much ranked near the top of geopolitical issues. And this is also something which we're going to be discussing today. Of course, we're not just going to be talking about China. We're also going to be talking about how other countries deal with this competitive field of infrastructure building, as I would call it. So, for example, we will have contributions on how Japan deals with it, and we would, of course, also be happy to engage some of the practitioners in here or in the stream about questions of how Germany or other Western countries should evolve their infrastructure development efforts. Before we start, I will just outline some very general questions that we had also posed to our panelists, whom I'm also going to be introducing in a minute, and which are guiding the discussions on this panel. We ask if these contending infrastructure initiatives are purely examples of strategic competition, so this one dimension of competition that I mentioned over influence in third countries, or if they also leave space for cooperation and complementarity between them. So can, for example, China and Europe cooperate on delivering developmental aid to Africa in, I think, mutual interest? We will then ask what are the competitive advantages of China's development model? And how can Western actors even begin to compete with that? How can they improve their own offers specifically calibrated to this task? We will ask, because this is a very, very urgent issue, I think, to think not just in terms of developmental aid providers, but also about recipients, why they pick certain offers over others. What makes these offers attractive? Because, again, if you use the analogy of a competition in a marketplace, the consumers are very important. And finally, again, bringing this back to the overarching topic of the conference, we will ask how this process is being shaped by their own regime characteristics. So again, talking about recipient countries here. So, before we get started, I'm very happy to introduce today's panel to you. Seated to my left is Dr. Zhang Hong from the Ash Center for Public Policy at Harvard University. She is focusing on China's role as a global development provider and the way in which China is using development as a tool of statecraft. So both externally, abroad, of course, but also to increase policy coherence within domestically, so within China itself. Further to the left is Dr. Vren Lindgren from the Norwegian Institute of International Politics. She is running a project there on the political effects of infrastructure and coming at this specifically through the lens of a Japan expert. So she's going to be mostly focusing on how Japan is also a very strategic development provider, is handling this competition with China. And then to my right is our discussant for today, Marina Rudjak from the University of Heidelberg. She is a sinologist, however, has also a lot of practical experience actually in the developmental sector, as she used to work for many years for GIZ, and then kind of fused these two strands of competence into her work on China's developmental aid and again, how it is using that internationally. And then finally, myself, my name is Pascal App. I'm a researcher here at PRIF. And my work over the past years has focused on the presence of the BRI, especially in conflict-affected states. So the question of what kinds of development impulses the BRI can bring, potentially stabilizing the situation, but also, as we will see, the very, very contentious politics that can come with this kind of influx of political agency. So at this point, I kind of have to take off my panel chair hat and put on my panelist hat. And for that, I would like to ask Marina to do the timekeeping for me, to just make sure that I don't exceed the allotted 15 minutes. If I do, then just rudely cut me off. And I'll be starting with a quick input on infrastructural authoritarianism, question mark behind that, talking about the competitive advantages and disadvantages of the BRI. So the reason why the BRI is a very, very prominent issue is because of its perception as a geopolitical issue. The perception, at least in Western countries, of the BRI has from its very beginning been through a geopolitical lens. So it has been one of perceiving Chinese infrastructure in third countries as something which again buys China political influence, could perhaps be used as even a so-called tool of empire. So thinking back to how European colonial nations used to approach infrastructure construction in their colonial territories. And this is a perception which has also stuck, although I would say that a lot of the empirical research in recent years has tended to go into a very, very different direction. So the valuable research, I think, has focused again on the local level, on how Chinese developmental offers are being perceived there, and why they are also being requested and chosen over that of other actors. And this is kind of, I think, a neat empirical puzzle, or maybe not so much an empirical puzzle for academics, but often for practitioners. Why do states cooperate with China? And the answer can be found, I think, in the competitive advantages that China is bringing to the table. For that, I think it is helpful to think about the global developmental marketplace, or perhaps maybe the specific sector of infrastructure, as, a competitive marketplace that is structured by exchanges between several centers. So those would be the countries that are capable of offering global infrastructure initiatives, that have the capital to pay for it, the technical expertise to build it in the field, and then a periphery which is mostly found in the global south. So countries that have a infrastructure deficit, that need funders to come in and basically provide what they consider to be necessary to spur their own internal economic development. The question is then, what kinds of interests do funders provide? So of course, if you ask people who are intimately involved in this exercise, they say, we have, of course, the best interests of our partners at hand. We only want to work for the benefit of the recipient countries. In practice, it is, of course, very often a mix of interests that also involves political influence, that involves clear economic objectives, like, for example, market access for your own construction industry. And also more immaterial goods, like, for example, status recognition. So the fact that you can portray yourself as a provider of developmental aid on the global stage imbues you with a certain status. And this is, I think, true really for all of those centers, regardless of whether that is China, Germany, Japan, the United States. This is really a fundamental divide between the global north and south. So this is, for one reason, pretty good news, however, for countries in the global south, because they have seen an increase in their own agency based on their ability to then choose between these competing efforts. So you can nowadays, if, for example, a funder in Germany has turned you down, pitch the same project to a funder in China. At least a couple of years ago, that had a higher rate of acceptance. And this, of course, also, again, increases your own freedom to choose between different models that you consider suitable. And there we can talk about then what sets these various initiatives, the BRI and competing Western efforts, apart from each other. So when you use this analogy of a marketplace, then I think it's also useful to think about the BRI as a disruptive element in all of that. The marketplace used to be dominated globally, I would say, by Western actors, especially in the region of East Asia, of course, also by Japan, an infrastructure superpower. And then along comes the BRI and basically pools existing expertise, existing linkages, of course, between China and the global south, and just supercharges that with a ton of additional capital, and really also with a completely new political will to go out and really make infrastructure building kind of a calling card of China's global influence. This, for the same reason then, has also been met with a kind of response by the players who used to be dominant and saw their existing status disrupted as a result. And they have in recent years kind of begun to repackage, relabel, sometimes also genuinely expand their own efforts. So for example, you have now seen efforts that are explicitly designed as BRI competitors from the G7 nations, from the United States, now a new consortium that is supposed to include India and countries in the Middle East. At the EU level, of course, we have seen a global gateway. And as Ren will be talking about, Japan has packaged its efforts first as so-called quality infrastructure and sees it a broader agency in the so-called free and open Indo-Pacific. So again, lots of competition, lots of actors, and all of them have specific advantages and disadvantages. Now, coming back to the topic of infrastructural authoritarianism, or dealing with autocracies more generally, the question for me is how these efforts are actually being shaped by regime countries of the regime specifics of the providing countries. So is there such a thing as democratic or authoritarian infrastructure? Spoiler alert, the short answer is of course no, but that does not mean that we don't see linkages between a country's regime type, the way its political institutions are being designed, and the way in which it provides development internationally. And I would say there are again two levels of dealing with autocracies in this field. One is, again, the international competition over influence, where Western actors, for example, want to develop alternatives to the BRI because they see this as kind of a firewall against seeing their own influence erode. And again, this is something which does not need to maybe be strictly constrained to competition, but also can also have elements of complementarity, for example, where specific funders bring specific advantages to the table. But it also has a second dimension of dealing with autocracies, of course, and that is how democratic donors approach authoritarian countries on the recipient side. Specifically, the question of how strongly they will insist on political conditionality for aid, especially when it comes to political reforms in the target states. And I'm going to be referring here to two empirical examples that are drawn from my own work on the BRI in conflict states, specifically two of them that I've been covering in a bit more detail, Pakistan and Myanmar, where I think you can really see these dynamics play out in practice. When we start with the case of Pakistan, I wrote a paper about that last year that was mainly about center-periphery tensions. So the question of how this influx of new developmental resources into Pakistan has kind of reignited existing distribution conflicts between the center and the periphery in that country. And there, I think you could see an impact that was shaped by the specific way in which China is providing this kind of assistance. So in China, most of this really, really high-level developmental work is conducted by an agency called the National Development and Reform Commission. That is basically an institution that used to be the Central Economic Planning Agency of China still in socialist times, and has still retained an enormous amount of influence over how these resources are being spent within China, and also in the age of the BRI internationally, because they basically have to clear projects abroad before they can go ahead. And when work started on the project of a so-called China-Pakistan economic corridor, so a Pakistan spanning transport corridor, also bracketed by industrial development sites that was supposed to link the country to the Chinese market, the question of how that would be planned and implemented in Pakistan became extremely controversial. And the natural partner for the NDRC on the Chinese side was the Ministry of Planning, Development and Special Initiatives within Pakistan, which is an agency also of the central government, which kind of monopolized all of this decision-making domestically. So this did not jibe well with the supposed federal structure of Pakistan, where provinces are supposed to really have a say on what is happening locally, and where they often complained that their input was not heard, that they also did not get an equal share of projects, that they simply did not see progress, for example, on projects that had already been agreed, and did not blame China for this, but again, the structure that had been implemented inside Pakistan to basically deploy these resources. So this kind of centralism is not something which China pushed on Pakistan explicitly, but I think just because of the way in which infrastructure building works in China, if you try to implement it elsewhere, this can cause political controversies. Specifically in Pakistan, we have seen, of course, political resistance against it, protests. In some extreme cases, also direct attacks against Chinese infrastructure projects, especially in the province of Balochistan. This is actually what caused me to investigate this a little bit more. And this is really an interesting case because, again, this is happening in a country that has a very, very close political relationship with China, and where many people are also genuinely fond of the Chinese developmental approach. So they speak admiringly about China's speed. But again, the political side has caused controversies even there. I will now turn to a second example, and also the last one, don't worry, which is, of course, an even more extreme case of BRI projects being embroiled in conflicts, and that is the case of Myanmar, that has been seeing a civil war there since the coup in 2021. I'm not going to be talking much about that, but about the aftermath and also the results which this has had to the activities of other funders. So, as you can imagine, working with an autocracies is always a very, very dicey topic for developmental funders in democratic societies. And this is, of course, even more true when we're talking not just about an autocracy, but basically a regime that is at war with its own people. This has led to a situation where many Western funders have withdrawn from Myanmar. Actually, that started even before the coup as a result of the Rohingya expulsion in 2017. But interestingly, one country is still there. That's what Ren is going to be talking about, Japan. So Japan has not expanded its agency there since, but it has pretty much continued with the agreements that were already in place before the coup. We can also maybe talk just super briefly about other examples where this relationship, however, between democratic funders and the conditions which they may be putting on aid provision, for example, is not as clear-cut. So, for example, Vietnam is a huge priority now for German developmental aid, and of course the political system of Vietnam is very similar to that of China, for example. So we can see that a lot of pragmatic cooperation is actually happening, and infrastructure building is not a purely competitive field between China and its rivals. So, in conclusion, there's no such thing as an authoritarian or democratic infrastructure, but again, the practices are very much shaped by regime characteristics. The question about who you engage with, both as a country at the country level and with agents within a recipient country. And I'm going to be closing, if I still have a couple minutes left. 5, perfect, or 4. Still manageable. With a list of competitive advantages and disadvantages of the BRI that I would identify from this research. Starting with the advantages, something where China has really discovered a niche for itself is in its willingness to enter high-risk environments. So Pakistan was basically deserted by Western infrastructure funding, and then along comes China and commits at present about 60 billion to that. So, as you can imagine, they now have this field almost entirely to themselves. And the reason for that is, again, that China is willing to incur greater economic risks when it comes to funding, but also, for example, political risks in target countries. So that means it kind of establishes a universe of states where other countries are not even competing. A second advantage is the lack of at least formal political conditionality that is attached to Chinese developmental offers. So at the very least, they usually do not attach their offers to explicit requests for governance reform or, of course, even political system reform in their partner countries. This is really something which, from the perspective of countries that were used to be met with such demands from Western states, sets China apart and makes it very, very popular. A third point is the strong elite focus in China's approach. So China, again, likes to work with institutions of the central government and with the attached political elites. And noticeably, it is also very, very quick and efficient to reach out to new elites in cases where those are being replaced. Like if you think about the example of Myanmar, China had a very, very good working relationship with the government of Aung San Suu Kyi, and then still continued working with a military regime that conducted a coup in 2021 and basically put her under arrest. So this kind of ability to weather severe disruptions in local political systems is clearly an advantage of China. And it's also, when you look at the scope of countries that China is working with, you really find regime and state types from all ends of the spectrum. You find democratic countries, you find theocracies, you find monarchies, you find different breeds of autocracies. It's really, I think, a testament to the willingness of China to not put ideology front and center in its development outreach. A fourth point I've already quickly alluded to, that's why I'm keeping this short, is really China's speed. And the fact that China is just technocratically very, very efficient at what it's doing in the infrastructure space. So really, local people can often see that in practice, and while they might not always agree with the political implications, the sheer technocratic prowess of China is undeniably impressive. And finally, this is actually a topic which Zhang Hong is going to be talking about. On the Chinese side, a closer integration between state agencies, government agencies, funders, construction companies, and also regulators, because all of them tend to come from a very, very state-dominated sector. So these are either directly part of the state or predominantly state-owned companies. And this really gives China an ability to rapidly mobilize and deploy capital in line with its overarching political objectives, much more strongly than if you're trying to herd the cats in the private sector. However, the reason why the BRI has not yet taken over the world is that, of course, it also comes with a couple of disadvantages. And these are, again, some examples which I can draw on from my personal research. First of all, there is a widespread popular distrust of China Inc. So people just talk generally about China. No matter whether it's a Chinese company, even a Chinese NGO, these are all considered to be parts of a monolithic China. And this also means that existing doubts about Chinese political agency, so the agency of the Chinese government, very quickly transfer to other political actors in the field. So there's often an intense suspicion about what kinds of objectives they're actually pursuing there. A second one, this is really a theme that came up over and over again, is little interest in stakeholder outreach. So basically outreach is being conducted to the actors who are capable of greenlighting and implementing projects, and that often does not include local communities in their vicinity. Their protests are sometimes being heard, but more often not. So generally this element of civil society outreach is underdeveloped in the BRI, and that sets it apart, especially from Western efforts. A third one is the overall lack of transparency. So the specific content of BRI funding agreements, for example, is very often not publicly known. There are some instances in which it has been leaked. We also have some pretty good databases by now. But the usual MO is to not hand out this information unless you are being forced. This, of course, also makes the BRI very susceptible to corruption and other forms of capture by local elites. And finally, at least in the early years of the BRI, you also had a problem with risk management. So basically, a lot of funding commitments were being made without paying much attention to the risk situation, both seen in terms of politics as well as economics. And that led to a situation where I think a lot of this capital was not very efficiently deployed, and you can explain, for example, phenomena such as a very, very high default rate on the related loans. So this is not an example of this often quoted debt trap diplomacy, where China is supposedly luring other countries into taking out loans which they know they can fulfill, but it is simply often a case of not having judged these kinds of criteria in the first place when awarding the loan. This is something where we're now seeing catch up. At least the total volume of Chinese outbound FDIs, especially in infrastructure, has declined markedly since 2018. And maybe there's some improvement happening there, but it's again something where Chinese capital is very, very much at risk under the BRI. Okay, I leave it there. I hand the floor to our second panelist, Zhang Hong, who is going to continue talking about the BRI and the broader governance apparatus within China that is managing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pascal. First of all, I would like to thank you to PRIF and to Pascal for inviting me all the way from the US. And it's really an honor for me to be here participating in this discussion. I'm sorry because I have a bad cough, so I have the kind of cough relief candy in my mouth just to prevent me from coughing up. So sorry about my strange voice. But today, the title of my talk is actually Rethinking China's infrastructure power. Because Pascal has been talking about my research about how coherent the Chinese state has been employing statecraft in terms of promoting infrastructure development all over the world and project Chinese influence. But the more I study this topic, the more I realize it is necessary to deconstruct this concept of powerful China, powerful statecraft. So today I'm going to basically make three big main points. The first of all, probably a little bit different from the conventional view, is that actually, I don't think China has a very articulate or coherent infrastructure policy, despite the BRI and despite the very highly visible push by Chinese leaders to promote infrastructure projects overseas. If we look at BRI 10 years on, there's actually no very specified targets in terms of how much China wants to invest in certain number of countries. There's no dedicated policy instrument, even though, of course, China has its foreign aid programs, China has a number of policy banks, financial institutions that supposedly should be serving the purpose of promoting the BRI. There is not a very dedicated, specified policy instrument that's specifically designed for BRI and the whole methodology behind how to use this instrument to promote that. And there's also no institutionalized policy making or oversight body authority. We heard about the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission's role in, as an economic planner and as a major policymaker in promoting a lot of China's engagement with other countries. NDRC itself is more like a think tank. It doesn't really have a decision-making power. And the only decision-making body that has been established for the BRI has been the leadership group, so-called the leadership group, at both the central level as well as all of the provinces. But these leadership groups actually have not been doing that many things. It has not met very regularly. I think it has met probably once or twice a year, mostly. And a lot of it is for mobilizational purposes. So for these high-level leadership groups consisted of, very senior officials at the central level and provincial levels. They will provide mobilizational, inspirational speeches to mobilize local actors, to tell everybody that this is a high-level aim, political goals that's associated with the BRI. But how to do it is actually up to the subnational level, the local actors, what kind of initiatives they come up from bottom up. So for all these purposes, I would say that BRI really doesn't have a very concrete policy program. This is in contrast with countries like Japan, as we hear more from Ren later, that has, articulated policy documents, articulating out how the government is going to do what and using what kind of policy instruments and which authorities will be responsible for that. So that's in contrast to countries like Japan and probably also South Korea, because maybe we'll hear more about that. And the approach of BRI that I will characterize, which is quite pertinent to our topic of autocracy versus democracy, is that Beijing relies on political signaling to mobilize local actors. Basically, the leadership have been repeatedly saying this is we have a very grand goal, noble goal of promoting development, global development, and promoting peace, etc., etc., and also to promote, to help China's economy continue to grow and help promote economic globalization. And with this kind of message, the local actors, including provincial governments and national and state-owned companies, as well as private companies, they realize that this is something the government would be probably devoting a lot of resources to, and it's kind of wise commercially for them to also go along this flow. That's how they have been mobilized to do things. So the characteristics of this autocracy-based, kind of doing BRI is that it doesn't rely on very clearly set out rules, but instead this kind of mobilization, which has always been a characteristic of China's policymaking and governance. So this is the first point that I want to make. And having made this point, I would really want to push us to think about China's infrastructure power, a term that I would define as China's ability to use infrastructure engagement to influence the host country's interest alignment. I would say when we try to understand this infrastructure power, we need to take a more bottom-up approach to see who are actually the most important agents. So I think that's why we need to pay more attention to the capabilities of Chinese infrastructure firms, as well as the competitiveness of the Chinese financing compared to all the other alternatives in the local market context. To illustrate this point, I will go by a region kind of analysis to give you some different ideas. Basically, I want to talk about Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and maybe just by contrast, Middle East, just as a comparison. And of course, we know in Africa, China has long been a very strong presence in Africa's infrastructure sector. And it's a region where Chinese infrastructure firms has been quite dominating. They basically take about 60% of the market share among all the world's top 250 firms in the African markets. This has been due to a number of reasons. One is the weak domestic capacity in the construction sector. So there has not been that much local African companies to compete with Chinese companies for the infrastructure projects. And for the European and US North American firms, probably Africa is not a very attractive place because, of course, they're not going to get very good projects, and also in terms of cost advantage of Chinese firms, they are more likely to be able to win project contracts in the African market. And this has been evident in the case of the projects that have been funded by World Bank, an African Development Bank. So these the largest share of these projects have been won by Chinese companies. And that shows you that the Chinese companies are really quite competitive, at least in terms of the cost benefit efficiency. So this is one part of the reason why Chinese companies have been so dominant. And of course, there's also a long history of the market entry of Chinese companies into Africa. Many of them have been in Africa since the Maoist times. So during 1960s, 70s mostly, a lot of the Chinese foreign aid has been going to Africa, as we all have heard about the Tanzania Railway. And so many Chinese foreign aid delivery units that were associated or affiliated with Chinese ministries or provinces have been operating in Africa since then. And after the late 70s and early 80s, when China started to transition toward a market economy, many of these former foreign aid units were commercialized and corporatized into companies of international contracting. So they kind of started to compete for projects overseas. So this is the third reason why in China, in Africa, is so dominant. And so because of all these reasons, that really gave rise to the opportunities to introduce Chinese financing into in Africa to support these firms' effort to win contracts. And that's why we have heard a lot of these in the engineering sector is called EPC plus F model, which means engineering, procurement, construction plus financing. So for a lot of contractors, their main advantage really comes from whether they are able to secure financing on behalf of their employer so that the project could take place. So in Africa, a lot of times, these Chinese companies would go back to China and lobby on behalf of their host country governments to borrow from China. And this gave rise to a lot of the government-to-government loans or G2G loans that have been taking place in Africa that supported Chinese companies winning projects, especially in large-scale infrastructure projects. And this, of course, is also in the context of the reluctance of multilateral financial institutions and other major bilateral donors to support certain type, especially the large-scale and risky type of infrastructure. So basically, this is a niche that China has been able to grab, especially in the African context. And also nowadays, we also heard a little bit, 5 minutes, okay. Oh, I haven't really covered Africa.
Take a couple more. We started early. It's okay.
We hear so much about China's development financing, but I think in a way this term is also a little bit misleading because a lot of these loans, basically, they are primarily driven by the mandate to support the going out of the Chinese firms for them to establish foothold in overseas markets, only secondarily justified as a narrative of promoting infrastructure-based development in the host countries. Okay, now I just want to quickly go to Southeast Asia as a contrast to Africa. In Southeast Asia, of course, Chinese firms have probably also a very long history of engaging in this market, and also thanks to the proximity, geographic and cultural proximity of Southeast Asia to China, many Chinese firms actually become quite localized in Southeast Asia. So compared to Africa, these firms really don't need to rely so much on this type of government-to-government loans or policy-oriented financing for them to be established locally. But at the same time, of course, in this market, they face stronger competition from both the local firms as well as other Asian firms, Japanese and South Korean, for example. And also in this region, the availability of Chinese loans are also less useful in securing contracts for Chinese firms compared to Africa, because you have competing sources from Asia Development Bank, for example, from Japan, Korea, and also these Southeast Asian countries generally are probably a little bit richer than African countries. They are able to afford to have some coming from their own fiscal budgets. So this one example that we hear so much about, the Jakarta Bandung high-speed railway, where China won the competition against Japan, I think it was actually an exception that proves the rules. Because originally the Chinese loan provided in its standard terms was not very attractive for the Indonesian government. The Japanese loan would be more attractive for its lower interest rate and also longer duration. But it's only after China agreed to forego the sovereign guarantee requirement, which is kind of standard for Chinese overseas government-to-government loans, then Indonesia decided that we'll go to China. But I think this is really just an exception. And in Southeast Asian countries, we have heard a lot of examples where the governments actually are very skillful in leveraging all these competition and to really advance their interests. And then I want to move a little bit to South Asia. I think South Asia is kind of between Africa and Southeast Asia. Similar to in Africa, Chinese firms also have relatively long history of operating in this market as contractors. That often dates back to foreign aid provision during Maoist time, and that was all very much driven by China's need to secure its borders. So China was building highway to Pakistan, building highway to Nepal, and also China was kind of building, having kind of good relations with Sri Lanka, for example. So a lot of political ties behind these infrastructure engagements. But at the same time, in South Asia, probably the market development compared to Africa is probably a little bit more advanced. So there are also other types of possible financing that could go into infrastructure development in South Asia compared to Africa. So in this market, China's infrastructure power or China's ability to influence local interest alignments through its infrastructure engagement probably is kind of also in between Southeast Asia and Africa. And then finally, just very briefly, Middle East as a contrast to all the other markets. Middle East has been a very difficult market for Chinese firms to penetrate, because it has a long history of where a lot of international firms come to compete. Even since the 1970s, when the Middle East first its construction boom, there were German firms, Japanese, Korean firms all going to Middle East. So their local governments and local employers have tons of experience dealing with all these different competitions. And Chinese firms were kind of where they were not, like I've been hearing this from many Chinese companies, they say Middle East is toughest. They don't know how to operate. And also Middle East countries, they have their own ample resources to support their infrastructure development, and Chinese provision of financing would hardly have any leverage in this region. So all these regions are giving all these examples. I just want to make the point that understanding China's infrastructure power, we need to really understand the actual capabilities of Chinese market players in these different markets, and the way the Chinese financing could be useful for these firms to compete for projects. And so finally, the third point I want to make is how will China's infrastructure power play out going forward, and what's the implication for Europe and US? First of all, I mentioned the government-to-government loans that has been proven quite useful for China, especially in Africa, to build relationships and also to support the infrastructure sector. We heard so much about already the debt crisis in African countries. So the room for further using this type of G2G loan to support infrastructure engagement has been very limited, and probably going to be continue to be very limited in the future, in the coming years. And at the same time, we also nowadays we hear a lot of China's shifting toward the model of small and beautiful, or small but beautiful. So it's like more China's kind of using foreign aid to grant and interest-free loans to support smaller projects. So maybe China's kind of moving a little bit away from the large-scale infrastructure projects financing to these small-scale social infrastructure type of, social welfare type of projects. That's kind of as a correction to the what has been going on in the past 10 years under the BRI. So in this context, we could see that the Chinese firms are really struggling to maintain their market presence because they are losing important sources of financing from China, and probably they are also going to be excluded from other type of financing from multilateral institutions, or maybe also from Western donors. So for the Chinese firms, they are now seeking to develop their own commercial capabilities. So they are moving up the value chain. So in this case, I've just done a case study of the Lekki port in Nigeria, which is a very interesting case because it's a port that's invested. It's not just contracted to the Chinese firm's construction. The Chinese companies also invested with equity capital, as well as there is going to operate the port for, I think, maybe 30 years or something. So this is the first port project where first port project in Africa where a Chinese company has a majority shareholding. And also very interestingly, in this case, the Chinese company, the reason why they finally decided to go into this project to invest equity was that they were able to form a partnership with a French shipping company, CMA, because CMA would be the majority shareholder in the operation part of the port. And it is because the Chinese companies, despite their very extensive experience in building infrastructure projects, they actually don't have that much experience in operating them, to commercialize them. That's why they very much rely on the more established players, mostly from Europe, to really go into this type of commercial projects to help them to move up the value chain. So this, I think, has a lot of implications for us to think about where, Europe, China, or even US, how they're going to work together or compete with each other in the infrastructure sector going forward. So I will stop here. Hopefully I'm not taking too much of a time.
Thank you very much. That was a really deep dive into how Chinese infrastructure agency is actually playing out in very many different regions of the world. And now we're going to be shifting to how others react to it. Again, Ren is a Japan specialist, so she's going to be focusing specifically on Japan as a provider and on Myanmar as the arena of this competition with China playing out. Ren, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Pascal, for organizing this panel, and also to PRIF for the invitation to come here. I've been really looking forward to this. It's my first time at PRIF, and it's my first time actually outside of the Frankfurt airport as well, and I've transferred there so many times, so it's really an exciting occasion. I'm looking for the discussions we'll have the next day. So as you've probably gathered now, I will cover the Japan piece in this discussion, basically the alternative to many of the Chinese infrastructure development projects. And I would like to do this, I think, in three different ways. The first way is really to provide an overview of Japan as a long-standing economic actor and an important player, not only in Southeast Asia, but also in the region, also in China in terms of being a development actor. And then I would like to talk about this inclusivity aspect that we've discussed in the panel. We'll probably discuss more in the Q&A, how inclusive the policies are of Japan for countries such as China or South Korea or other competitors. And finally, I would like to discuss a little bit about what Pascal has referenced a few times, which is the case of Myanmar, where I have done some of my field works, particularly on the Japanese enterprises in Myanmar, their historic engagement, but also their present-day engagement, both in the pre-coup and post-coup context. So in setting the context, Japan has been absolutely a long-standing provider of development assistance, and the use of economic instruments to secure Japanese foreign policy objectives has been central and has been a way for Japan to not only project power, but also to demonstrate what kind of a foreign policy identity Japan wants to have in its international engagement. Its use of economic instruments has been particularly pronounced, I would say, over the past 15 years with the advent of the second Shinzo Abe administration from 2012 to 2020, where we saw a significant upgrade in policies related to development assistance, but also security assistance. And I would like to spend some time discussing how these link together. This means that ODA is still very much a central part of Japan's foreign policy repertoire, as I have termed it elsewhere. It takes the top budget post in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Japan. And it's a development aid that's a matter of economic interest, but projecting power, but also more and more security interests and the idea of what is strategic for Japan. And this is important because, in a way, it goes back to the roots of what Japan first engaged with in its development policy, where it was often tied and very much linked to the economic interests of Japan. And one might wonder why Japan wants to get involved in development policy at all. And in my interviews with stakeholders in Japan, it's always interesting, both in the agencies but also in the field, that there's a narrative, a very strong narrative about Japan having the unique profile of being a recipient of aid in the post-war era, having its miraculous reconstruction in the following years, and then already being a donor of aid in 1950 when it gave its first loan to India. And the important know-how that Japan developed as a prominent actor in the field of aid policy is something that Japan prides itself in and thinks it is a type of export. And so it extends this to its engagement with other countries in the Indo-Pacific. And today, this narrative has taken on new meanings, as I said, because it's increasingly more focused on security and national interest, and very explicitly, which has been a touchy subject before. And this is not perhaps surprising when you consider how it's linked to the dual external challenge that Japan faces of a rising China and a potentially less committed and capable partner in the United States. The severity of the regional security situation, with many flashpoints that have historical roots, such as the East China Sea, Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, in addition to the ripple effect of Putin's war in Ukraine. And I mention it in this context because, again, it has had implications for aid policy. And we see this even most recently in July of this year, when the Japanese government announced a new policy called official security assistance. And one could argue that this is a policy that competes potentially with China. And in this new cooperation framework, which does not fall formally under the development of umbrella aid, or under the umbrella of development aid, because this is very contentious in Japan, because it engages with military engagement, it falls under the security policy umbrella, but it is very much an aid program in that it is, quote, providing equipment and supplies as well as assistance for infrastructure development to the countries with a view to strengthening their security capacities and improving their deterrence capabilities. It is aimed at, quote, deepening security cooperation with like-minded countries for the benefit of armed forces and other related organizations, and is part of the efforts to reinforce the comprehensive defense architecture. OSA is viewed by analysts as another response to Chinese influence, and particularly in the Southeast Asian countries concerning flashpoints such as the South China Sea, in that it involves the capacity building of coast guards, the transfer of patrol boats, but also technological transfer. So in summary, Japan's ODA has become much more securitized, is much more linked to its security policy, and along with this, China factors greatly in the security policy. So then how are these policies inclusive? Are they at all? And I think here we need to go back also to some other policies that have not been recently updated. But one of the most prominent policies that Pascal has also referred to, and maybe perhaps many of you in the room have heard about, is Japan's quality infrastructure policy, which was first announced in 2015, but has been unveiled in a number of phases. And this initiative paralleled upgrades in Japan's development cooperation charter with this idea of quality growth. And the term quality is really key in the projection of Japan's aid policy. And it features prominently, but what is it meant? What is meant by quality? Here it is meant that it is inclusive, it is sustainable, and it is resilient. But there are caveats to this, inclusive in the sense that those who would like to be part of this approach need to sign on also to the values that this approach promotes, which I will speak about more shortly. So many perceived this initiative as a response to the BRI. The timing of it happened in 2015. The BRI was announced by President Xi in 2013. The reality is this is an initiative that actually had its first review and advisory board in 2013, so it paralleled very much the beginning of the BRI. But you could argue both the BRI and Japan's development initiatives precede the actual formal initiation of the BRI in 2013 or the Free and Open Indo-Pacific in 2016, which I will talk about in a moment. So the level of competition between these two initiatives, I think, is clear if you see how they have paced up over the years, but there's always the door open for inclusivity among a number of caveats, according to the Japanese government, that is. So this partnership led on quality growth developed and increased commitments from Japan in just within the first year by 30% to almost 116 billion US dollars up until 2020. And a year later, Japan announced when it was chairing the G7 that it would have even more of an export expansion. So it's been rolled out in different phases. And what's interesting here is it's happened in many mega summits or events, some of them hosted in Japan, such as the G20 or the G7 or at UNGA. And Japan makes a point of kind of getting partners, like-minded partners, to sign on, involve, or endorse its own policies in these settings. So highlighting the values that they reinforce. And so we see that the G20 reinforced, in fact, this initiative, made their own initiative, quality infrastructure in Osaka in 2019 when Japan was hosting. And among the principles that were indicated were economic efficiency in the view of a life cycle cost, but also debt sustainability. And in addition to private level and public level financial sustainability, the macro level debt sustainability of countries where projects are operated should also be considered in a transparent manner. This is on the heels of the big debate about debt traps within the BRI. So there is, although no explicit mention of China, potential linkages or alternatives to how to have transparent financing in these initiatives brought about by Japan, but then endorsed by the G20. And I think this is an important point, that many of the policies that Japan are promoting do not mention China, but they kind of make references to points that could be argued as values that are not promoted within Chinese projects. And Japan refers to helping Southeast Asian countries, for instance, escape the middle income gap, which we know is something that China itself deals with. So it reiterates the values-based approaches and the transparency and the rule of law, and this has been a great point of contention in policies bilaterally with China, especially related to territorial disputes. In other words, what Japan promotes it is perhaps its way of saying what it thinks China is not doing, and perhaps vice versa. So taking in this ideational account, this relationality, this way of differentiating the different approaches, I think is quite important in reading between the lines of these policies. And again, these policies, while they do not link China specifically, they do link many of the issues that are discussed in the new generation of security policy documents, which came out in Japan in December 2022, a new national security strategy, a new defense strategy, where they are very explicit about the threat that China poses regionally and as a neighbor to Japan. So one could argue by degrees of association, they do have a message about China. I think the policy that best represents perhaps the connection between the security aspect and the development aspect is the Free and Open Indo-Pacific policy, which we had referenced before. It was first introduced in 2016, and the second version, or the FOIP 2.0, as it's referred to, was released this March. And this has been one of Japan's most prominent foreign policies in recent years, and has incited a number of other Indo-Pacific strategies in the US, in Europe. I know Germany also has an Indo-Pacific strategy. And the point here is the inclusivity on this, again, is reiterated as a values context. So now, in the second version that came out in March, it's the idea that the Indo-Pacific is a concept that anyone can sign on to. It's a mindset, is what I've been told in my interviews. And even if you're not part of an Indo-Pacific country, but just an individual interested in the values it's promoting, you're part of it. So everyone in this room could be part of the Indo-Pacific context. And in doing this, it becomes quite fuzzy as to where these values start and stop. And I think the challenge here really is hashing out also what kind of support you can garner for this kind of a broad policy. In Japan's eyes, I think it was a way to maybe engage more with ASEAN states that didn't want to feel like they had to choose sides between China and Japan. But at the end of the day, not excluding anyone, not creating camps, and not imposing values does not always match up with many of the other policies that Japan is promoting. So there's a contradiction. And so I would like to just talk a little bit about the connectivity aspect of this policy, because I think this is interesting. In a sense, the idea of connectivity, which was promoted also in the Quality Growth Initiative, is where Japan and China compete heavily. They have different ideas of connectivity corridors, especially in Southeast Asia. Often Japan's connectivity corridors are lateral, whereas China's are often vertical, also based on where borders are with certain countries. And connectivity is really used as the key of success in linking Japan to the Asia-Pacific, to the Indo-Pacific rather, also through Southeast Asia, South Asia, and then Africa. And here we have the idea that was introduced now in March 2023 of multi-layered connectivity. It's a strategic approach to the region that centers on economic and geopolitical activity, and Japan wants to lead this. And basically here it's enhanced through communication infrastructure, port hubs, industrial value chain, with India, and also emphasizes the importance of knowledge connectivity, which is increasing human and cultural exchanges, research, information exchange, higher education exchange, and tourism cooperation. And I think this is interesting because I think this idea of knowledge connectivity is an area where Japan sees it can also compete with China, although there is a lot of cooperation and there's a lot of support for Chinese students, for instance, in Japan. So people are viewed as bridge builders, and they even have recently announced this idea of providing FOIB, free and open Indo-Pacific fellowships to researchers like some of us in the room. Included in this type of connectivity is also the important topic of digital connectivity, which is worth its own panel. So I won't go into detail, but this is very much seen as another area where Japan and China are competing, specifically in the context of the Pacific Islands, where we see underwater sea cables being greatly debated, the security needs around them, the sustainability of them. So finally, I'd like to talk about my last few minutes about how this actually plays out a bit and reflect also on the fact that Japan was a donor to China for over 40 years. From 1979 until 2021, Japan provided China with ODA. And it was primarily in the form of concessional loans, but as China's economy took off and in fact overtook Japan's economy in 2010, became the second largest economy on GDP terms in the world, Tokyo gradually reduced its aid, and the Prime Minister was quoted as saying that Japan had completed its historical mission. And so I think this development shows that Japan views China as a different kind of actor, and that they've had a long-standing relationship with showing China how aid can potentially be done, much of which China has learned from Japan, but also it knows how the Japanese way involves certain types of values, and that the promotion of quality infrastructure is important, and that growth is something that is a choice for China to choose to do or not in terms of values-based ideas. In 2018, there was a significant meeting between Prime Minister Abe and then Premier Li Keqiang, which was an opportunity, I think, for Japan and China to start anew, in a sense. They had decided that they wanted to actually try to cooperate on projects in third countries, infrastructure projects, especially in Southeast Asia, and they had this list of different ideas, and Japan was describing China as a partner and a neighbor rather than a threat, and it was a headline-making event. It was really high times. I was based in Tokyo at the time, and many of us on the ground were quite skeptical about the feasibility of this, but thought, okay, this is really exciting if this is possible. And then the project discussions started, and there was very little publicly shared about these discussions, but the long and the short of it is nothing happened. There's not been a single project. It's been very difficult, I think, particularly especially because of the values-based diplomacy that Japan pushes, especially the rule of law, to sign on to projects and actually feasibly work on them together. But I wanted to, on this point, close by saying a few words about my research in Myanmar and how we have seen on the ground points of collaboration and cooperation, because I think it's inaccurate to say there is no collaboration or cooperation between Japan and China if you look at specific projects and what's happening at a local level. And in Myanmar, we see that the cooperation often happens when a Japanese project physically meets a Chinese project. And so this is often hard infrastructure projects. You have a road that is meeting a bridge, a Japanese-built road that is meeting a Chinese-built bridge, and they have to talk to figure out how this is going to work out. It's ad hoc. It's often efficient, but it's not something that comes planned. It's not something that they prepare for. It's not something that they really proactively try to engage in. That's not to say they don't engage, but there is levels of cooperation at certain local projects. Where I think we are meeting challenges now, and I think this is based, of course, on the very tragic situation that Myanmar faces today, is what the future is of a potential cooperation, if there is any. I think now it's even grimmer today than it was a few years ago, not only because of the challenges in the context of Myanmar, but also because of the US-China rivalry, Japan being a very close ally of China and being very vocal about the threat that China poses to Japan's own economic and national security. And so in moving forward, I think we will see more innovative ways of using the Japanese toolkit of economic instruments. We see this already in its recent development cooperation charter, where they've talked about the idea of funneling money into startups in Myanmar more at a local level, since they can't have direct engagement with the government because it's a military government that they don't recognize. So still trying to find ways to make projects that will soon time out, actually, especially those under the auspices of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, finding ways to make sure that they will work. And should these projects work, I bet there will be more engagement with China, naturally, on the ground, when projects meet. So on that note, thank you so much, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Ren. This is also a point which I've always found fascinating, you know, how much of China's developmental approach is actually built on the Japanese experience and the specific Chinese experience as a recipient at one point. Okay, so much for our panel input. Then I hand over to Marina, who's going to be providing her feedback. Please, Marina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for these three very fascinating inputs, Ren and Zhang Hong and Pascal. I learned a lot, and it's a very difficult task to discuss you, so I will try to do my best. I would start with Hong's presentation, and the very interesting point you highlighted, that China does not have an articulated and coherent infrastructure export policy, but works on political signaling, which equals the campaign style and policy experimentation style we have seen in other sectors. You have described the very fragmented decision-making structure, which is also something I've observed in my research on the Chinese aid system, which is kind of the other side you have touched on. What I was wondering when you talked about the implications of the fragmentation and the lack of coordination with the market behavior confusions and distortions with your Pakistan example, is that at least if we look at the regulatory side of development financing, we see that in 2017 the Chinese government passed administrative regulations for policy banks, where a substantial part referred to credit procedures and credit risk management. Probably not many of you in the room are aware of that. The China Development Bank, which is the world's largest bilateral lender, has been operating since 1994, since its establishment, without dedicated regulations. They were orienting themselves on regulations for Chinese commercial banks, but specific regulations for the China Development Bank and the Exim Bank and the Agricultural Bank of China were passed only in 2017. So what I was wondering is, kind of the cases you were referring to, were they pre-2017, or do we see that these regulations actually didn't have much effect in terms of addressing credit risks? I'm not sure actually the document is translated. Maybe it is. If it is translated, take a look at it, because kind of what we know from the wording of Chinese policy documents, if you read a lot of, we need to do this, we need to establish that, it tells you it's not there. And then the document talks about environmental risks and reputational risks and risks to public protests and so on and so forth, which tells you that actually, and cultural risks, that there was not much consideration of that previously. And finally, on your first point, in many other cases where I've encountered this campaign-style policy, the question arises, could it be actually exactly the strategy not to have a defined strategy, but in order to be able to stay agile and to respond to things as they arise. Your second point on China's infrastructure power, you looked at the capabilities of Chinese infrastructure firms and the competitiveness of Chinese financing as the reasons for dominance of Chinese infrastructure firms. And I found one point particularly interesting, namely the long history of market entry. And this long history is, very long. If we're talking about Complant, which is one of the major providers of infrastructure financing, it was founded already in 1959. And it was transformed into a state-owned enterprise, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 90s. And then there was a general debate that without the support of the Chinese state, Chinese companies were not competitive internationally because they had too little understanding of cultural context. And the point that came up in your later example, that Chinese companies are good in building but not good in managing, is actually something that we see in the Chinese debates since the privatization of, not privatization, but the turning of ministries or government agencies into SOEs in the 1980s and 90s. You've treated companies and financing as separate factors, but what I wonder is, would companies be competitive without the financing of the Chinese states? We talk about international tenders, and there we see Chinese companies win very often because they are the cheapest. But then, like in the case of Indonesia that you cited, they are cheap because of the willingness to strategically underbid if necessary, which is what happened in Indonesia. But that comes with great risks and doesn't always go well. It did go well in Indonesia. It didn't go very well in Eastern and Central Europe, where we have the examples of Poland and Montenegro. I think Poland, it was a road for the Euro Cup, where the company in the end had to withdraw and Poland had to finish it itself, or with Montenegro, where Montenegro approached the European Union asking for a new loan to bail out and refinance the Chinese road project. So the question is, how competitive is China really then outside of contexts where it doesn't really have competition, like in Africa, where the only serious competitor is probably India? And if kind of there is no competitiveness without state financing backing, do we then have to redefine competitiveness? And kind of, view competitiveness differently when there is a Chinese state behind it. And the final point, implications for the European Union and the United States. You brought the point of the port of the co-management with France, and this is something we know from infrastructure projects that, for example, German companies have provided consultancy services on international standards to Chinese companies, which is, by the way, something I heard a lot in Beijing expressed by Chinese officials when talking about trilateral cooperation or third market cooperation, which is a policy of the NDRC, that China should do the hard infrastructure, Germany and Europe should do the soft infrastructure in terms of standards. And I think your talk showed that we need a much more sober debate about Chinese infrastructure in Europe, that not everything is as shiny as it seems, and also understand that China is moving into spaces well-off countries have neglected. This applies both to Africa, but if we look here at home in the EU, that also applies to Central and Eastern Europe. And I will come back to that after discussing Pascal's input. So, can you just tell me my time?
About halfway.
Halfway, wonderful. So Ren, yeah, thank you very much for your point on Japan's, for your input on Japan's development cooperation policy. And I've been looking a lot at Japan in my own research because, as you rightly said, this is something China took on a lot as a model, because Chinese officials admired how in the 1980s Japan managed to provide aid to China and support China's development to resource-based loans, what China did later in Africa, by the way, and while helping China's development, at the same time helped Japanese companies internationalize. FOCAC, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, is also borrowed from TICAD, from the Tokyo International Cooperation Conference with Africa. Now, listening to you talking about the free and open Indo-Pacific policy and how it is argued inclusively, not as a something that is limited geographically, but is a mindset that everybody can be part of. I was wondering, isn't that kind of similar to the Chinese approach? With the Belt and Road being something that everybody can be can sign on to, and or the Global Development Initiative, where if you read the first progress report written by think tank CIKD and you look at early harvest, the early harvest is there is a friends of GDI at the United Nations. There has been a pledge and of support at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, and at the ASEAN +1 meeting, and at the China Latin America Forum and FOCAC, and so on and so forth. So what is really the difference? And we could argue the difference is one is based on universal values. The other one is based, like the Chinese government argues, on shared or common values. So basically finding something everybody can agree on. I'm not saying it's the same, of course, but I think this is probably something worth looking into. And I found also very interesting what you just presented in terms of pragmatic cooperation between Japan and China, which is similar from what I've been hearing from German trilateral cooperation projects with China. There are not many, but some in the textile sector in Southeast Asia. And what they have reported is that when they encounter obstacles to cooperation, this is slightly similar to what you have described, the reasons are mostly not ideological, but actually administrative logics. And there was a very, very interesting example they cited where they wanted to invite local trade union representatives to a conference, and the Chinese side said, no, we're not going to do trade unions, don't even try to convince us, don't even try to change us. And the German side said, yeah, but it's really important for us, so how can we make this work? And then they started talking, and the Chinese side said, well, if we invite the ambassador, we have to write a report and explain why we have to this trade unions and so on and so forth. So the solution was simply not to invite the ambassador. Yeah. Another possible solution the German side offered, let's just not put their name on the participants list. And this kind of raises the question where, from the European side, and I think Japan is just much more pragmatic on that. This is not something that should be pursued more actively, because it is also an entry point to understand the administrative logic on the Chinese side when it comes to development cooperation projects and infrastructure development, which, let's be frank, we don't really understand, and we better should understand it. Finally, I come to Pascal's presentation, and I really was intrigued by your concept of development and infrastructure financing as a marketplace. And then I wondered, is it really a marketplace? Or has the West, I don't like the term, ever really viewed it as a marketplace, since at least when it comes to aid or DAC development cooperation, there is no way to pay back. So China provides win-win cooperation. I'm using the term, and it's reciprocal by design. So it is an exchange, it is a market. DAC donors provide charitable aid, which at least nominally, and there we are in the whole debate of Mao's gift theory and critical development studies, cannot be paid back. Except, of course, DAC donors expect the rest to become like us and to become more equal to us. But that's not really a market. Or maybe a dysfunctional market where one part of actors operates on market-based principles and the other part doesn't. So this kind of, maybe just as an idea to dig a little bit deeper if you think this is something worth looking into. And maybe but to follow up with the marketplace idea, maybe this is the reason why the recipients don't see DAC donors or Western or Northern, however you want to name it, development cooperation and Chinese cooperation, development cooperation offers as competitive. Maybe with the exception of Japan in Southeast Asia, because they just provide different goods. China provides hard infrastructure, the West provides soft infrastructure. So going back to Hong's examples of obviously realistic and working side of Western cooperation, or Ren's examples of Japanese-Chinese cooperation in Japan, that would suggest that if we think in terms of development effects and benefits for the local population, this kind of cooperation would be useful and sensible. But then we come back to realpolitik, and this is something I've been talking a lot to German politicians. And then, well, we see the problem that, like we see in German, mit China gewinnt man keinen Blumentopf. With China, you're not going to win a pot of flowers in the current political situation, and everybody is afraid that if you start arguing pro-trilateral cooperation, you end up, at the best case, of being accused of whitewashing, and in the worst case, of being accused of supporting authoritarianism. At the same time, we have to admit that whether PRI fails or not, it has been a huge success. First of all, as Judy Moore, the former Liberian Prime Minister of Public Works, said, before China came along, Europe had not much creativity in what to do with Africa. I mean, we are neighbors. Has there ever been a European infrastructure initiative? Yeah, not really. So China came up with this idea to link the poorest countries in the world with the richest countries in the world. And also it made us move. We now have this wonderful letter soup of B3W and PGII and GG, Build Back Better World, Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment. I'm getting confused, and the Global Gateway. The problem is, all of them seem to be more about solving our China problem than solving the common development challenges. And unless we shift the way how we think about development and actually start thinking of, African or Latin American or South Asian development and infrastructure challenges as our problems and not their problems, China is going to outcompete us in the marketplace of ideas. And I would end with kind of, a pledge for, pragmatic approach. And even if we have this trinity of systemic rival, strategic competitor, and partner, to be pragmatic in the sense that systemic rivalry does not result in strategic incompetence. And look for ways to cooperate pragmatically where it is actually for the benefit of development of the Global South, because it is our shared problem. So, and I stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And an excellent point at the end that the German government and also other European governments are also struggling to even just define this bilateral relationship with China, right? Where we have to assume 3 parallel roles instead of just a single one. Okay, I would suggest the following. Since we have about a little more than half an hour left, that we collect questions from the audience. And then we have a final round where everyone can respond to Marina's points as well as the questions raised from the audience. Okay? Great. Then I open the floor to the audience. Please just raise your hand and briefly introduce yourself before asking your question. Thank you. Jonas, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks.
You can maybe. Okay, it's coming.
People, the crowd. Yeah, thank you so much for these presentations and the comment. Just one question to get this started. I think all of you alluded a bit to this, but perhaps a bit more explicitly. With a view to our conference topic, to what extent does China, the Chinese government, who's doing all this, care about regime types in the countries where these things happen? It doesn't seem to be the simplistic kind of we prefer autocracies and we don't like democracy kind of thing. This doesn't seem to bother them too much, but to what extent is there perhaps a preference? I think, Pascal, you mentioned the centralization. So there might be like centralist government, it might be better states that are really kind of hierarchical because it's just perhaps pragmatically easier. Or stable ones, or they don't like monarchies or whatever, right? So could you, like, they are pragmatically cooperating with everyone, but is there something where we could identify kind of preferences or either if they are ideological or rather pragmatic, right? Thanks so much.
Then you can hand right over to Irene, who also had a question. Please go ahead.
Okay, we're abusing our roles as organizers. Sorry for that. So please come in, everybody. But just it's more a kind of follow-up question, maybe then to Ren. As you said, like the Japanese Prime Minister said, mission accomplished in 2010, when China had reached a certain economic development. How's the Japanese discourse now? Is it more like, what have we done? Or and how does it apply now to other contexts where the regime dynamics might not be in line with Japanese government now? Thanks.
Question? Yeah, on third row. And another one. Okay, then we just keep the mic in the third row.
Yeah, thank you very much. Christine Hakenesch from IDOS, and has been very interesting debates on this first panel, and I learned a lot about China's current engagement in infrastructure development. And I was thinking about your inputs from a perspective of how the EU has been engaging in Global Gateway in recent years. And there are 2 points that I found very interesting. First, Zhang Hong, your observation that at the end of the day there's not really much of a strategy that is BRI, but there's no clear goals, there's not really policy instruments. It's really about pragmatism, and this links very, very nicely with your points, Pascal, up that you made, where the advantages of BRI. I mean, if you put the two together, it's really about pragmatism, going where the need is, where an interest is, and then trying to do what is possible. And then when I think of how the EU has been going about a Global Gateway, which is very much set up as a competing initiative to BRI, it probably has been trying to do the opposite. So there is a clear goal of 300 billion. Putting a price tag makes it very difficult for the EU to live up to very high expectations that it is creating. So I mean, it's more for comment than of a question, but maybe the EU could have learned a bit more from how China has been going about this initiative in order to be successful with Global Gateway in the end. And then a second point, I mean, the panel is about how external actors are dealing with regime types in engaging in infrastructure development. And what I learned from the panel is, again, that in China's engagement, there's probably a lot of pragmatism, and maybe sometimes it's easier, but maybe less of a preference for regime type. When I then think about the EU and how the EU is engaging in infrastructure development, there's of course a question where to go in the first place. So maybe where not to go because of regime type. But then the much more difficult issue is that my impression is that there's really not enough taking into account the domestic politics of infrastructure development and seeing infrastructure investments really as a political issue. So still it is perceived within the EU very much as a technical investment, so to say. And the political economy issues linked to infrastructure investments, I would say, when I look at Global Gateway, are still hugely underestimated. And now that Global Gateway is also set up as a competition or as a competing initiative towards BRI, this already lack of looking at the domestic politics of infrastructure investment in the past, I think with this competition is getting even more difficult. If we look, for instance, to make that concrete at Eastern Africa and Global Gateway activities in Eastern Africa, there's a lot of looking at, okay, what is China already doing? Where can we invest in order to not just complement Chinese products and Chinese investments and activities? And thinking about this, there's very little discussion about, okay, what does it mean that it is set up as a value-based initiative in the first place in order to be different to BRI?
Okay, thank you. If you could please pass the microphone to your left. We had another question and then one in the second row.
Hans-Jürgen Puhle, Goethe University, Frankfurt. I have a small question, a bit speculative. The Belt and Road Initiative today obviously no longer is what it used to be or was when it was launched or invented. Some elements have functioned better than others and differently in different regions, and better in some questions and not that well in other questions. And my question would be, asking the experts, I am not an expert in the Belt and Road Initiative, whether they think there is a certain trend that might be identified, or whether it's just more fragmentation, more sectoralization, more compartmentalization.
Okay, thank you. Then on to the second row and then back to the third one.
My name is Marianne Kneuer from the University of Dresden, and I would like to get back to the question of strategy, existent or not. You said that there is no coherent strategy, and I found very interesting what Marina said. Maybe the strategy is not to have a strategy. And I would like to drive this even a little bit further and say and ask, could it be that there are two different levels, so to say? I'm not an expert in China, but I know from other countries, you know, that possibly there is no articulated strategy, no transparent strategy, but maybe there is a strategy that is not visible, but it's there. So my question would be, is it possible that we have there, so to say, a two-level game of strategies?
Thank you. And then back to the third row.
Hello, my name is Li. I'm from the Chinese Consul General in Frankfurt. Well, I would prefer to speak German because I chose German as my foreign language in the uni, but I will try my English. Yeah. So I want first to thank you, thank PRIF and Mr. App for the invitation. I think when I saw the topics, I hesitated because you got the topic dealing with autocracies in a fragmented world. Well, actually, we are not a fan of the dividing of the countries into the autocratic or the democratic. But I'm glad I came. Because I heard the inputs of the participants, and I think I should come. And Mr. App talked about the advantages and disadvantages of the Belt and Road initiative. I think it's quite balanced and it's quite different from what I read in the German meeting. So, now I come to my question. Actually, I want to say in the past 40 years, China developed very, very fast, and actually we had very much experience in infrastructure. So we actually, with the Belt and Road Initiative, we also want to share our experience to the other developing countries. So I think with this initiative, we are open and we want to cooperate with other countries, with Germany, with Europe, also with the USA. I think some of you also talked about the democratic or automatic structure. Should we divide it into two blocks? What I'm more interested is how we can work together to help other developing countries, because now I think a lot of developing countries, they face a lack of investigation to the infrastructure. So I want to hear, well, how do you think, and how should we work together to help them? Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have further questions? Yes, back there, and then one in the middle and one in the front. Okay. Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, the general topic of our discussion is actually regime competition. And I didn't hear much about regime competition in the sense that Jonas and Irene have been talking about. It's, you know, it seems to be an issue of economic competition between different states who are at a different level of their specific developments. So what is the role, in a more specific term, of the competition of systems, which are to be an issue at this conference? Thank you. I should say my name is Lothar Brock. I'm an old hand at the PRIF Institute in Frankfurt. Actually, I think the oldest one.
We have known you for quite some time, yes. Okay, we had one question in the middle there, and then one in the second row. Could you please raise your hands again, so we know where to put them? Okay.
Hartwig Hummel, Heinrich Heine University, Düsseldorf. I'm a political scientist, and I would like to raise even a more general question than Lothar Brock raised. It's a peace research institute here in Frankfurt. So, and as I know, peace research and economic cooperation, or something like that, you have introduced that as low politics. And so the peace strategy would be to cooperate in low politics in order to somehow to mitigate conflicts on a more security-based level. So, and I'm not sure what the results of these presentations are in this regard. Does Belt and Road Initiative contribute to somehow lowering the competition in security and increasing the cooperation in the political terms? Or does it write the opposite? So does it increase competition in political terms? And my second question is about the actors. I'm quite surprised that we are talking, or most contributions talk about states as actors. Don't we talk about globalization anymore, about the private sector and the transnational companies, not just German companies, but European or even global companies? Don't we talk about regional integration? So that's not about Germany, it's about the European Union. It's not about Myanmar, it's about ASEAN, etc. So what about this level?
Okay, and then please onto the second row.
Thank you. My name is Benjamin Schütze from the Arnold Bergstresser Institute in Freiburg, and I just have one question regarding your use of the analogy of a marketplace for development cooperation. And I'm just wondering, isn't there a certain risk of depoliticizing highly uneven power relations by using that analogy? Because, of course, the idea of the market kind of suggests that there are forces of supply and demand which somehow magically meet and create the equilibrium of the market. And ultimately, I would argue that these forces are never actually on the same, they are highly uneven power relations. And yeah, so just the question whether that depoliticizes these. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any more hands. Oh no, there's one, please. Okay, and then maybe we switch back to the panel because this was a lot of questions and we're going to need some minutes to work through them all.
Thank you very much. I'm Karamba. I'm from the Gambia, and I'm somewhat affiliated to PRIF because I've worked on a project titled Local Perception of Regional Forces here in ECOWAS, and I was part of the research assistant. I guess it was the last speaker that made reference of the Global South, tying it to the Belt and Road Initiative. And during the course of our presentation, she had alluded to the fact that the Global South does future in the PRI. And I just, and also mentioned the issue of mutual interest. But I wanted to know whether it is more of mutual interest or China trying to massify her external polarities. I mean, what would she make sense of this? I guess that goes to Marina. Yeah.
Okay, then maybe one really, really final question.
Hello, everybody. I'm Andriy. I'm from Ukraine, and I'm just a guest here, also a student. And I have a question about transferable military medical lessons from Russian-Ukraine war and Eastern Ukraine war in Crimea Republic. And is it possible to hold here to speech about Eastern war and Ukraine conflict?
We talked about this earlier. You cannot hold a speech here today.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, then we move back to the panel. I've got a very, very long list of questions, so I'm just going to tackle some of them, and then there will be more than enough left for other participants. I'm maybe going to start with the question about the marketplace analogy, since this was actually raised by two of you, and why I believe that this is apt. So first of all, you are of course correct that this is a marketplace that is, like marketplaces also in economics, fundamentally structured by power relations. This is what I alluded to when talking about several centers in the global north that are providing the development solutions and the periphery in the global south that is taking it. I would just say that the marketplace analogy is being created because you see at least competition between these various northern centers. And also why the point that you alluded to, whether it is actually a marketplace, I would say yes, because the interests in the northern centers are not purely financial or economic. Very often, I mean, this is perhaps actually an analogy to the Cold War. You have the situation that for the global north, it is much, much more about gaining international backing, for example. So we have this seminal research on correlations between developmental aid flows and then voting coalitions in the UN General Assembly, where recipient states then start to back their donors. And this is something which I think China is handling in a very, very similar way, that also the objective is often not just economic, but also much, much more immaterial when it comes to status recognition or building, of course, coalitions, especially in the global south, where China, of course, also has a much better image than among Western nations. There was a question also about how this links to peace research and whether we can sketch like an actual agenda for cooperation going forward. I would say that infrastructure politics now is probably not as low politics as it used to be, simply because the BRI in particular, you know, has become such a target because it is so synonymous with Chinese global agency nowadays. And I think actually a contribution which maybe this panel can make is to really open the field up a little bit beyond that, to really acknowledge that, China may be a more strategic actor than somebody in Europe, but it's still extremely heterogeneous. And a lot of the outcomes that you see on the BRI globally is really a patchwork of projects that were locally negotiated, often designed in response to local interests and not so much Chinese ones. And where I think acknowledging this a little bit better and also acknowledging that there is a recipient perspective that we should pay a lot of attention to if we understand this field as competitive would also help us avoid the pitfalls of securitizing this whole thing, of basically only thinking about the BRI in terms of a Chinese geopolitical tool that is threatening our own security. Because I think that is a point at which you fundamentally diverge from the perspective of actual recipients and then also can no longer understand anymore why they are actually taking these offers. And then a very, very small point in response to Jonas' question, does China actually have preferences among its partner countries in the BRI? It would be interesting actually to see if there's correlation between the total volume spent in a country and what kind of regime type it has. I mean, off the top of my head, I can just say that the top destinations are very, very heterogeneous. You have Pakistan, which is a democracy, however flawed. There's Russia, of course, an increasingly authoritarian country. There is Saudi Arabia, which is a monarchy. And then you have a smattering of other countries drawn really from all world regions where there doesn't seem to be much rhyme or reason that goes beyond like a more opportunistic strategy of where you actually found sympathetic elites who are willing to partner with China on something. And often the reason is really political, but not like in a regime sense political. So for example, if you want to answer the question why there are so few BRI projects in Europe, the answer is simply that our tender guidelines inside the European Union make it very, very difficult for this Chinese model to work, because this kind of union that a Chinese funder pays for the thing and then a Chinese SOE is tasked with implementation, that just wouldn't fly according to our guidelines. And so it's really these kinds of regulation schemes which are, I think, probably also skewing the marketplace there. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I would suggest we just go further in the order in which we spoke.
Yeah, thank you. So I think I'll start by addressing the question of whether there are two-level strategies, because I do want to clarify. I do think that in the head of the Chinese leaders, there is a strategy that's very much motivated by geopolitical and geoeconomic purposes. And like Pascal said, I also studied in DRC in the process of planning for the BRI, in the process of coming up with the 2015 vision and actions documents that really lays out a seemingly quite coherent strategy of how to improve connectivity with China's neighboring regions and how to promote infrastructure development as well as industrialization. That seems a good strategy. But what I'm trying to talk about today is really when we think about how China is going to translate these visions into really operations, actions, that really depends on a lot on the capabilities of Chinese companies and Chinese financial institutions. And that's why I'm trying to give you all this breakdown of regional differences. They really differ a lot depending on how long they have been operating, how much they know the local market, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I agree that maybe no strategy is a good strategy because it's more pragmatic, it's probably more adaptive in some sense. But on the other hand, we also need to see that it also leads to a number of negative consequences. For example, the Chinese companies have been, because they can rely on Chinese loans to support their winning contracts of large-scale infrastructure projects, we do see cases where Chinese companies kind of collude, if we can use that term, collude with the local ruling elites in pushing for big projects that are not necessarily viable in the long term because they could get this financing from like easy financing from Chinese banks. So that resulted in high level of indebtedness in the whole borrowing country, and also the Chinese companies are probably not going to benefit in the long term because they kind of screwed up in some high-profile projects, and also the Chinese government's reputation also was damaged as a result, as we see in the case of Sri Lanka, probably. So the reason why I want to mention that this is the lack of clear policy instruments and mechanisms to oversee this process can result in a lot of these messy consequences that could, in the long term, harm China's interests as well as the host country's interests. Yeah, also want to echo about this, any preference for regime type. I think there are some quantitative studies that do show there's very little or there's not significant correlation between the allocation of Chinese financing and regime type. And from a more grounded perspective, qualitative case study, we do see that the Chinese companies actually prefer to work with countries with better governance, most likely to be in more democratic countries with better institutions, because yes, they could work with autocrats to work on some to push for some large projects, but in the process of building that projects, they might also encounter a number of troubles, like the government, the autocratic government might not be delivering their promises. They will be very difficult to work with, so on and so forth. That will become a headache for Chinese companies as well as financial institutions as well. So yeah, that's just an observation in that. So I probably give the floor to Ren.
Yep, great, thank you for all of the questions. I'll touch on a few. First on Marina's point about the similarities now between the BRI and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, now that the Free and Open Indo-Pacific has become a little bit looser in its value, pitched more like a mindset. I still think if you look at the actual documentation, and in the case of Japan, there is no written out FOIP policy, which is quite interesting, but there's a 55-page heavily detailed PowerPoint. You see that there's actually a lot of ideas about what you need to sign on to in order to sign on to the FOIP. So I think, in a sense, this idea of it being a mindset sounds nice, but in reality, when you look at all of the details and what kind of projects they're pitching and what kinds of ideas they have, there are a lot of check boxes that you have to fill in order to qualify, and that's where many countries who could potentially be interested fall short. Yeah, I think comparing those is also interesting in the sense that now, 10 years on, since the inception of the BRI, we're at this phase where we're thinking, okay, what has the BRI done that has been successful? What has potentially been a failure? How do we evaluate this? And what is the BRI? And we realize just how difficult it is to still define this and how difficult it is to actually get empirical information on exact examples of success stories. We hear much more about the issues with the BRI. And I think with FOIP, we're still in a stage where it's newer, but it's based on a long policy that Japan has had of development assistance that has had a lot of kind of crown jewel stories. So it will be interesting, I think, in the coming years too, in terms of similarities and in terms of looking at FOIP 3.0, we'll be to see what the problems are actually and to be more honest and upfront about them and to have those come forward. And I think this relates to your point about the challenges of cooperation due to administrative logistics, because in Myanmar, I encountered this a few times in my interviews when I said, okay, so if you were to work with a Chinese company on doing a contract, what are the kind of challenges that you run into in terms of standards or formalities? And they would say, well, actually, sometimes the Chinese companies, they want to use pencils when they write their contracts because then they can erase things and change numbers later, and we don't do that. That's not allowed. So things like literally how contracts are written, but also environmental standards were a huge discussion in Myanmar, and the kind of requirements that Japan has as a DAC country, whereas other alternatives such as China do not have to meet the same standards. So I think these formalities of the administrative logistics are quite important in considering options for consideration. And moving to your question about this point that Japan kind of said, okay, we've given you your 40 years of ODA, you know how we do it, time is up. How this is kind of transpired now. And I think it was interesting because someone else in the audience mentioned the point that China actually also wants to show other countries how it does ODA and why it does ODA so well, right? But in a way, maybe a lot of what China has learned is actually from Japan. So I think there's also this sense of, what we have done and taught you, and then you've taken and kind of made your own. There's a lot of similarities there, actually. But where the divergences are, again, relate back to the formalities and related to Japan's commitments not only to environmental standards, but the values, the openness, the transparency. And the fact that Japan, as we've talked about, has signed on to so many of these other international multilateral engagements, whether it's the International Pacific Economic Framework or Bring Back Better World. They're at the forefront of these as a strong ally of the US. And so in a way, they've committed to a lot of other other language beyond their own policy documentation in implementing infrastructure projects. And I think that's where they kind of distinguish where their approach is different. It's more global, it's more aligned with like-minded countries, and the rule of law and democracy and freedom and transparency is primary. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, then thank you very, very much again to our excellent panelists and of course also our very distinguished discussant. I hope that has given you a lot of food for thought. We continue now to a half-hour coffee break before we reconvene for the second panel, still about dealing with autocracies, but shifting the geographical focus to the MENA region and the topical one to climate and energy policies. Thank you very much again. A round of applause for our panelists, please. And then enjoy a coffee. We'll reconvene at 2:15. Thank you.
Hello, 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 hello. Is this working? I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for interrupting you. But we will continue. But I promise there will not be an awful lot of long talks, no PowerPoint presentation. I think, I'm quite sure, no PowerPoint, no long talks. Just a brief set of remarks, and then we will have the chance to continue such an informal get-together, and then even with some sect. So this is just a brief prelude to then a couple of glasses of sparkling wine. Great that so many of you have remained here for this ceremony. So my name, just introduced, I think I didn't do this before. So my name is Jonas Wolf. I'm obviously also here from this institute, heading the research department on intrastate conflict and being a member of the executive board. But I'm here today not in this capacity, but in the capacity of being one of the 3 members of the jury of the Ernst Otto Czempiel Award, together with Eva Senghas-Knobloch and Jörn Grevingholt. So the entire jury is present today, and that's really great. And it's even greater that we also have, of course, Roger McGinty with us, who is this year's award winner of the Ernst Otto Czempiel Award. Very briefly, as I promised, the Czempiel Award is an award given by the PRIF Research Institute in Frankfurt since quite a few years, since 2008, in honor, as you might either know or guess, of Ernst Otto Czempiel, one of the kind of towering figures and founding fathers of German peace research, and also one of the key kind of founding persons of this very institute. And for these 2 reasons, PRIF, some almost 20 years ago, decided to establish this award in honor of his role in German peace research and with a view to this very institute. This award has been, since 2008, been awarded every 2 and now every 3 years. So we're celebrating today the 8th edition of this award, so our 8th award winner. And this is really the first in-presence ceremony for this award since the pandemic, so that's really great for us, I think. Not the first annual conference that we have in presence since the pandemic, but the first ceremony, and it's, I guess, at least as long as I've been doing this, participating in the jury, the first time that we have the entire jury and the award winner also in presence here, so that's really, really great. Fortunately, I don't have to tell you a lot about the book we are honoring today, because Eva Senghas-Knobloch will in a minute give the laudation and explain to you why the jury decided to give the award this year to Roger McGinty's book on everyday peace. I also guess in a crowd of peace and conflict scholars, I don't have to introduce Roger McGinty a lot to all of you. He's certainly one of the most prolific kind of writers in the field of peace and conflict studies, very well known in particular for all his work on questions of peace building, of course associated with the whole debate about the local turn in peace building, local peace building, everyday peace, as we will hear later, but also way beyond this specific debate. He's a professor in defense, development, and diplomacy at Durham University in the UK. And you will hear more about the book, as I said, in a minute. I will only emphasize one final issue. We in the jury have been very happy. This time in recent editions of this award, we usually had only a few nominations for this prize. So we made an effort to increase, in particular, the international visibility of this prize. We used to receive more nominations from Germany, but this really meant as an international award for the best monograph in international peace studies. And we did this, and we were very successful, so that in this case we had really 19 nominations that complied with all the criteria, so we are fortunate to be able to read all of these books, and really quite a whole series of these books were excellent. So it was also then at the end quite a difficult process, but there was a consensus decision at the end, and Eva will tell you, not in a competitive sense why we choose this book over others, we not talk about the others, right? But why we think that this book, the others being also excellent, is really the one we thought deserved the Czempiel Award 2023. And with this, I already stop and just say congratulations, Roger, on behalf of PRIF, and now hand over to Eva. Thank you.
This is all right, so? Could you understand? Okay, good. Good evening, dear colleagues and dear Roger. I have the honor now of speaking on behalf of the jury for the award about the Roger McGinty's outstanding book, which has earned the distinction for this year, 2023. Now we have heard already, we live in a time of worldwide crises and conflicts, not a few of them violent or very violent. While public attention is directed mainly at matters of national security and military means, at least in the general public, Roger McGinty has countered by publishing a book with the title Everyday Peace, subtitled How So-Called Ordinary People Can Disrupt Everyday a Violent Conflict. His book aspires to answer the urgent question of why official peace negotiations and agreements on ceasefires so often fail to end the use of weapons, let alone resolve or even transform the underlying conflict. McGinty argues that these formal approaches on the high political level are implicitly based on the assumption that the result of the negotiations and agreements on the top level will trickle down to the multifarious interactions in everyday life. On the contrary, he makes evident that a bottom-up approach is also needed to actually anchor peace. A proper analysis of the actions and micro-actions in everyday life can recognize what kind of sorrows preoccupy the daily life of people in conflict areas and how they handle them in dangerous situations. Besides many other sources in conflict-ridden contexts, his findings from the project Everyday Peace Indicator and the project Making Peacekeeping Data Work for the International Community demonstrate what kind of security is urgently needed on the ground where people live in violent long-term conflict. For example, the elementary desire to be safe from rape when walking to a toilet, testified to by many women, including those in United Nations-run refugee camps. Conversely, such contextual research can also identify the skills in everyday life that constrain violence, de-escalate, and create space for civility. McGinty identifies 3 modes of action of ascending intensity in this context: sociality, reciprocity, and solidarity. With his focus on the small acts of everyday peace, McGinty draws our attention to the bottom of societies and communities and to the multitude of informal social relations that co-constitute societies and communities. His findings show that this level is as important as other levels of relations, whereby the different yet interconnected levels should not be understood as a hierarchy of relevance. He launches his concept of circuit and circuitry to explain the connectivities between the hyperlocal or local level and those level above, which are more common in peace and conflict research. The theoretical perspectives of the international relations discipline and political science covers mostly formal relations between states, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and organized civil society. Circuit and circuitry, in contrast, express the phenomena of interlocking systems and their dynamics. They shall make us aware of how the local and the hyperlocal can be part of wider systems and are linked to processes of scaling up and scaling out. The book's arguments pay tribute to the fact that life in every community is based on formal and informal social relations and institutions. For instance, at the hyperlocal level, the family, in all its very different forms and power structures, teaches and practices ways of thinking, obligations, and patterns of care in everyday life. Dedicating a chapter to the relevance of family, McGinty takes up the long-standing critical points of feminist scholars, also of peace researchers, against a pure rationalist understanding of human actions. McGinty unpacks the relevance of the informal and the small in disrupting the pervasive logic of violent conflicts. He demonstrates that small peace acts can be far from banal when showing how, even in brutal conflicts, be they national or international, individuals and groups may carve out spaces for human or even humane agency. Everyday peace practices encompass a broad spectrum of intensity. To mention just a few cases, McGinty writes about the young people in Belfast regularly listening to their punk music during the Civil War in Northern Ireland. In their socializing behavior, they ignored the dominant conflicting passions of identity. And McGinty describes the solidaristic care for a Christian hairdresser by a Sunni family and other acts of mutual support between the politically charged religious groups during the Civil War in Lebanon. And he reflects on the intervention of a small group of the official Sudanese army to protect protesting civilians from attacks by a government militia. McGinty reveals that violent conflict is often encompassing but rarely completely totalizing. Yet, the specific acts are less visible, often hidden. Nevertheless, they might contribute to changing the way conflicting groups think and can construct their narratives. Although the book focuses on internal violent conflict and fractured societies and communities, it deals with international wars as well. He uses an amazingly broad spectrum of literature and innovative methods, taking a convincing stand to include pioneer studies of peace research and also historical documents, diaries, field letters, and testimonies. For instance, those of former soldiers in World War I and World War II. Besides the expression of horror, hate, and deep enmity in these documents, he also discovered descriptions and self-descriptions of multiple forms of tacit and less tacit resistance undertaken by recruited soldiers in armed battle. For instance, in World War I, French, German, and Belgian soldiers used the Christmas truce and Christmas Eve as an opportunity to come out of their trenches and meet their counterparts as human beings on the battleground between them. A brave, humane activity soon stopped by higher ranks of the military, yet it took place and is well documented. The practices of everyday peace in conflict areas can extend, as McGinty argues, from grudging toleration of other groups' identities to acts with the capacity of eventually transform a conflict. Even in brutally violent conflicts, the tasks and obligations of daily life demand or motivate practices that can disrupt the logic of conflict. Whereas truce and ceasefires may interrupt violent acts, everyday peace acts can disrupt the conflict, at least momentarily, jumbling the conflicting modes of thinking, feelings, and passions. McGinty develops the thesis that such disruptive actions of everyday peace represent a type of power that also requires specific skills. The power used in everyday peace is not a coercive power over, but a relational power with, a power from, and a power to. It's tied to self-restraint, moral example, participation, and courageous leadership. The necessary skills for this imply that a person or a small group can read a very specific social situation, can identify opportune moments with the necessary emotional intelligence, and can ward off criticisms from the broader group someone belongs to. Underscoring that there is a civil society beyond the organized group of civil society. He also wants to direct our attention to those internal debates in political science which reflect on the ethnocentrism of the discipline that must be overcome in order to decolonize international relations. It has to be emphasized that this book does not romanticize everyday peace. As the author argues, the chance of small acts to scale up or to scale out depends on several factors that hardly can be controlled. The concept of circuitry makes us understand the complexity, or as McGinty says, the messiness of the entire range of connectivities in which informal relations play a role beyond formal structures and can disrupt the hegemonic norms of a conflict. The book invites researchers to situate the ongoing discussion in international relations about the local turn within more levels of analysis. Such an approach implies, in my view, that international relations, along with the other disciplines contributing to peace and conflict research, need structures that enable inter- and transnational research. Roger himself demonstrates the competence of transdisciplinary research in his book. His Everyday Peace Indicator project, the other field studies in several countries, as well as his many publications, refer to anthropological, social, psychological, sociological, and historical sources and studies, thereby underscoring their high relevance for peace and conflict research. No less significant are his reflections on the relationship between field research and the affected people in the field. It may be that these reflections also demand a newly differentiated role for peace researchers. Roger, my very sincere congratulations.
Looks like this. Congratulations. And the
If I might be permitted to say a very few words, I know it's been a long and fascinating afternoon. This might be the first occasion in human history in which a book with a weed on the cover has won an award. I want to sincerely thank the committee for this award. Wading through 19 books was a lot of work, so I'm very, very grateful. But I also want to congratulate PRIF on having a book award on peace. That's a statement, and that's an important statement, so well done. And of course, peace is quite unpopular. There are a lot of pressures on peace at the moment for very understandable reasons. One only has to look at the news. At the beginning of the Northern Ireland peace process, or in fact just before it began, the Irish Prime Minister confronted the British Prime Minister, who at that time was quite suspicious about beginning a peace process, and demanded, "Are you afraid of peace? Who's afraid of peace?" Because in many ways, continuing conflict is easier than the awkwardness, the uncertainty of pursuing peace. So there's a lot of talk at the moment, understandably, on artificial intelligence, on AI. My book is about EI, emotional intelligence. It's about individuals who take a stand, who use tactical agency, who read the room, who navigate awkward situations. Let's face it, we all do that every day in the workplace or possibly in the home. But in deeply divided societies, this is important. Being able to read the room is the difference between physical confrontation and maybe getting safe home in the evening. So the book has a deliberate focus on the everyday, on the individual, on the hyper-local, because that's how we live life. No one lives in Frankfurt in its totality. Instead, everyone who lives in this city lives according to particular networks. They live in a neighborhood. They have repeat journeys that they do every day. And in a sense, the book was explaining that the everyday is important, and that often the state actually plays a relatively small role in many people's lives. In some of the conflict-affected countries, you might see a police corps once every 3 weeks. You might never see the government until they come looking for tax. So the book was very much about the everyday, but somehow tried to connect the everyday with all of the other levels in this trans-scalar world that we live in. And I thought the everyday was a very useful lens to allow us to see intersectionality, allow us to see gender, caste, class, and all of those other things that pattern life. So the book argues that small changes can potentially have significant impacts. I was interested in ad hoc organic initiatives, in pro-peace and pro-social change makers, these social entrepreneurs who live in communities, who are charismatic and make a difference. And again, we know all of those people in our own lives, in the communities that we live in. But in deeply divided societies, these people who cross boundaries, these are people who are transgressive to the norm, which is one of division. So often these everyday peacemakers are non-escalatory in their activity. They avoid conflict. But sometimes these individuals go further. They engage in de-escalatory activities. They calm tensions. They intervene to save or improve lives. They take initiatives to rebuild relationships. In many ways, they are the first responders after a conflict to show civility to the other group, to do business with the other group, to include members of a minority in a social outing. I don't pretend that these everyday peace actions change the strategic picture, but they can save and improve lives. They can disrupt the logic of conflict. They can factor out, they can be iterative. They can change norms. Very often this is a negative peace, but sometimes a negative peace is a vast improvement on violent conflict. And I think one thing that our disciplines can do is perhaps be a little more celebratory of negative peace rather than dismissive. Maybe give it 1.5 cheers and see it as a platform to become less negative and more positive. So I deliberately wrote an optimistic book in times in which it is difficult to be optimistic. And I want to thank PRIF and the committee for recognizing that sometimes you have to be optimistic in what is a challenging world. So I'm deeply grateful. I've never won anything in my life. I was amazed when I read the email because I didn't know I had been nominated. And if you will indulge me with for 1 minute to say something personal, and that is, if you're writing a book, it means there is another person in the household, okay? And this unwritten book or half-written book is a presence in the household. And it's not a happy presence. This person, we'll just call it the book, is perpetually grumpy, is always needy, needs me time. So I just want to say in a public forum, thank you to the long-suffering Mrs. McGinty.
Okay, thanks. No additional talk, just organizational issues. The sect is about to arrive, first. A second, I'm not sure whether YouTube is still on, but I think now we say goodbye to those joining us virtually and welcome you again tomorrow morning at 9. The kind of active participants who will join us for dinner are invited to either meet us here at PRIF's reception at 7:15, or for those who want to go to the hotel first, we meet you there in the lobby of the hotel at 7:45. So 2 options, either here or you go to the hotel first and we meet you there 7:45. And that's it, I guess. I don't know where the sect is, but there it is. Thank you and see you tomorrow.